Welcome to this keynote conversation for our 4th annual Digital Knowledge Sharing Workshop here at the Library Museum of the American Philosophical Society. This program is an activity of the Society's Center for Native American and Indigenous Research and its Native American Scholars Initiative. My name is Kyle Roberts. I'm the Associate Director of Library Museum Programming, and I'm so glad that you've been able to join us today. To begin with, we would like to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. We also wish to acknowledge their continued presence and perseverance despite centuries of land theft, removal, and persecution of their language and cultural traditions. The Society also acknowledges that it has benefited from being an occupant of this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. Because of that, through its Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, the Society seeks to promote research that honors Indigenous knowledge, cultivates scholarship, and strengthens language and cultural traditions. We express our sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who've offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that made this work possible. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to arts and humanities, the sciences, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please do check out our website, amphilsoc.org, and we'll put the link to it in the chat, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We're using Zoom webinar for today's discussion, so not to worry. You have all been muted. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button, and that's going to be on the bottom center of your navigation bar. You might want to locate it now. Use that Q&A button at any time to ask a question. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation today. We are also very happy to be able to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it during the panel, please click on the CC box on the bottom navigation bar of Zoom. It's to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's discussant, Stephen Curley. Stephen R. Curley is an enrolled citizen of the Dene Navajo Nation and is the director of the Digital Archives for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. The acronym for that is NABS. And we'll be, again, as I said, providing links to these organizations in the chat. Stephen is a professional archivist with extensive experience working with tribal community archives and museums. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology with a minor in American Indian Studies from the University of Arizona and a Master of Arts in Library and Information Science from the University of Arizona with a focus on archival practices and methodologies. He's worked with tribal governments, groups, and communities regarding the development of cultural heritage institution services, programming, and information management capacities. He has also served as the chair of the Society of American Archivists Native American Archive section from 2018 to 2019, and is currently serving as a council member for the Society of American Archivists for the 2020-2023 term. So with that, let me turn this over to the APS's director of the Center for Native American Indigenous Research and our Curator of Indigenous Materials, Brian Carpenter. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us. We're really looking forward to this conversation with Stephen R. Curley. Before we jump in, I want to briefly also use this opportunity to spread the word about a couple of relevant fellowship opportunities that we have for which applications are currently open through March 20th. One of them is for the Digital Knowledge Sharing Fellowship, which is the fellowship around which this current workshop we're having at APS is about. The Digital Knowledge Sharing Fellowship supports people who need to do research in archives, whether it be APS and or another archive, to access materials, especially utilizing digital components and especially in support of Indigenous community supported or directed projects. And the digital component of it is very broadly construed to be any, well, most projects these days have digital components, but past projects under this fellowship program have included things such as the establishment or development of community local archives, the recording of oral histories with elders, language reclamation projects of various kinds, and many others. So we encourage you to, if that sounds of interest to you, we encourage people to look at that. There is no requirement for any being in a graduate program or anything like that. It's open to all applicants, and it's open for people regardless of geographic location as well. And that DKS program also has, as part of it, a summer digital knowledge sharing workshop, a 2-day event that's held here in Philadelphia. The next one will be in late July. The other fellowship I'd like to let people know about is the Indigenous Community Research Fellowship. This is designed to help Indigenous community entities and individuals to visit Philadelphia. It also is meant to facilitate groups that need to come to Philadelphia in support of similar projects to get a full sense of materials that are here at the APS, to work on projects similar to the ones I mentioned for the DKS fellowship, but with additional elements of the ongoing work of developing a relationship between tribal nations and non-tribal institutions such as the APS. This is a fairly new program, but it's also a permanent program. And so we encourage people to look into that if that is of interest. And myself and my colleagues will be glad to field any questions at the contact information in those links. And both of those fellowship applications are open until March 20th. So please share around to anyone you think would be interested. Thank you. And with that, I would like to welcome Stephen Curley here. So we will get him up. And Stephen, welcome. Glad to have you. How are things with you in Minnesota today?
Hey, thanks, Brian. Yeah, thanks for having me here. Happy to be here. First off, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from the Twin Cities area of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, which is currently on or located on the traditional Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. Secondly, of course, want to thank you all, Brian and the rest of the APS staff there for asking me to join in today and for really pulling this event together. It kind of seemed like it was a quick turnaround, and hopefully I'll try my best to have this be an informative conversation. So I'm happy to be in such good company as well with the digital knowledge sharing cohort. And I read a little bit about each of your work, and I heard a little bit about it from Brian. So I'm kind of very impressed with some of the work that you're doing. And yeah, I just want to reaffirm that Indigenous information professionals like yourselves are contributing to this renaissance. Really, it's really a renaissance of information and data management that we're really seeing unfold and take shape for the past 20 years or so. And the fact that tribal centric archival and librarian practitioners like yourselves are contributing to this data reclamation and data sovereignty renaissance in real time is pretty exciting to me, and I follow that type of work. So it's exciting. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, we appreciate all that, and that touches upon a number of things that we're going to talk about in our conversation today about taking a look at a look back at health and a look forward on state of affairs in the archives field, especially in relation to work between native and non-native archival institutions and many people who need and want to interact with that, the nature of research with Indigenous archival materials, and creation of projects such as, or organizations such as where you're working now to get a chance to look at what the NABS Healing Coalition digital resources are as well. But a good way to start out is kind of we were thinking about this earlier, a good way to begin of sort of an entrance point into this might be just kind of how you and I met as archivists, how we started working together some years ago. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up some, as we're talking here, we'll be looking at some visuals, some slides that we'll be referring to as part of the conversation as well. And as I get my share screen up here, I will can you confirm that's showing up right for you there, Stephen?
Yeah, I can see that.
So yeah, how would you like to start talking about how we started working together?
Yeah, I think it might be worth it to just kind of back up a little bit and just kind of because I was kind of having a hard time trying to organize my thoughts around what it is I'd like to say today, and you and I have had conversations to try to organize that. But I think really my sort of purpose of being here is kind of in threefold. So I think one of them is fairly obvious. I think one of them is to engage in conversations about my work with NABS, to kind of maintain a strong arc of awareness in what we're trying to put all of our energies into trying to build, and that really translates to truth and history and justice and truth with respect to the historical assimilative period of American history. And I think secondly too, I think I'd like to try to communicate, I guess, my observations regarding some sort of phenomena of truth telling that I'm seeing as sort of opportunists who are sort of superficially kind of contributing to these efforts because it's essentially trendy, and the market calls for it. And I just want us to be kind of aware of that type of activity. And I think I'm going to try to relate that to some of the things that I'm starting to observe in the records as I'm engaging them. I think the last thing is really kind of doing a little bit of a retrospective with regards to the discourse of archivy in relation to source community considerations of reclamation, enculturation, and reparative description, and stuff like that. And just trying to wade through a little bit of my reflections on the PNAM, the Protocols for Native American Archival Material, or at least those same motivations that inspired the PNAM, before PNAM was even a thing. So yeah, to answer your question and to kind of talk a little bit about this topo map that we're seeing here. I don't know. I was trying my best to remember how I met Brian, but I remember it started out with a simple email. I had sent you kind of word of a grant project that I was trying to do. This was during my stint working with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And the thing with this particular tribal archives is that elders collected material photocopies and retained those things in their own personal collections. So one of the things that was robust on my to-dos was to track down duplicates and make it easier for me to process and acquire clearance for using them, and those sorts of collections management activities, I guess. So one of the larger bodies of records was in working with the federal recognition manuscripts or papers, kind of a research body of records that were accumulated since the 70s. And those were really powerful in illustrating the tribe's inherent sovereignty. And so those records particularly were subsequently repurposed to inform their land and trust operations, their bid for land and trust that I believe was recently secured. So it's kind of nice to know that those records were of service, to that tribal nation. So for an archivist like myself, there's really two truths, and this is just for speaking for myself. Is that one? It's really an uphill climb to try to normalize both within the community, meaning wherever or whoever your community archive services, and without, meaning amongst the community of practice that does not service your community, and just kind of normalizing operations and creating dialogue and discussion around bolstering those services. And the second thing for me that is true is that the historic record, you're so dutifully trying to curate and imagine and use in a tribal archive or tribal setting, those records exist elsewhere. So, thankfully those two items are kind of progressively becoming more and more manageable. And that's hopefully what this topo map is illustrating, is that, there's repositories who hold and steward and possess records relevant to tribal community. And that's true for any community. But for a tribal nation who's wanting to secure, secure its inherent and express its inherent sovereignty, that's a lot of work to do. And so you'll see here that I don't know if you can make that out, but there's a green plat, and that's Mashpee on the Cape, and you have all these different sort of satellite institutions that are kind of like the Harvards of the world. There's Athenaeums over there. There's historical societies and the like. And way over on the left is the American Philosophical Society. So there's a contingent of records that relate to Mashpee. And in case the point I'm trying to make is there's distance. There's a disconnect between those records that can be purposed for language revitalization, for community sort of awareness, for developing a historiography that's obscure, and for just kind of bolstering a general sense of history within these communities. It's harder to do, essentially. So again, just trying to hit home this point that disparate possession of the historic record in relation to source community was very much the case with my work, and is kind of like an ongoing theme with my work thus far, especially as it relates to my work with NABs, which I'll talk about in a minute. Yeah, so do you want to reflect on that a little bit, Brian?
Well, one thing that it made me think of is how I think both for whether it's Tribal Nations Archive or other entity in a community that's trying to interact with and knows that there are these materials related to and from the community in these various places, like you noted, it's often very, from that side, can be very confusing and opaque as to how and who to get in contact with at those places, what those places can, understanding what the level of awareness of those places in relation to what the nature and significance of those materials, whether they're equipped or have any experience in tribal nations and working with tribal nations, and so on. And so even there's the one task of figuring out where things are, but then not every place seems approachable, or even if they do, it's kind of can be hard to tell. And then in turn, where there are non-native archives that have materials from indigenous communities, those that are equipped and aware of trying to also do outreach and reconnect, they can in turn sometimes not know how to get in touch with the correct entity or contact in the tribal nations, because different communities, different nations have different organizational structures and so forth. So I'm curious, in terms of your work there, in terms of reaching out to different places, did you find that there was a lot of variation in terms of the ways that places wanted to operate, in terms of the information they need, staffing that they had, preparation they had to do that kind of work?
Yeah, just kind of generally my response to that is it kind of differs, and it's really based on, like you mentioned, capacity, whether or not there's staff to sort of lend the assist to somebody like me, making all these the list of inquiries about sharing collections and getting permissions of use to use them, and really depends. And also, it kind of depends on their level of having processed, relevant collections too, because they might not be anywhere near a point where somebody like myself can come in and start selecting, things that I'd like to essentially accession into, a tribal archive setting. But I think the other thing that I wanted to point out too, with just kind of generally, is that digital initiatives, like some of the work that the cohort there is doing, can fix both can fix both of these sort of shortcomings, I guess. There's no small dose of investing in resources to do so, and essentially doing so well is the other thing. So working with community and meeting their needs kind of needs to be centered in those sort of logistical considerations for any initiative, really, especially if it's a tribal or a non-tribal institution wanting to do that. Yeah, that's my response to that.
Yeah, and did you find that's helpful? And did you find there's also, and this may get into other things we're interested in talking about more in the conversation too, especially later on, did you experience, or have you heard others there in similar positions express concern about different, sometimes institutions don't appreciate the nature of that source community, tribal communities' connection to the materials, not just as any, it's different from just normal researchers. And did you find differences in institutions' ability to see that the nature of the connection to the material is different than just any normal research inquiry?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subject matter there, but I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind is there's a different culture of way of doing things, essentially. So when you sort of look at reading rooms, of course, especially if you're at like a research facility or a research university, you kind of have to jump through hoops, to sort of get at the material that you're wanting to consult with. And so, that for any community member, that's going to be a huge sort of deterrent from even asking questions. And so I think that's kind of one of the easier things to sort of hone in on and try to create sort of other separate avenues for community to come in and utilize certain records and certain collections. Reading room of course have policies in place for security reasons and that sort of stuff, but if we start to think differently about community use, I think there's a lot of potential there. So yeah, I wanted to talk about a little bit about my work with NABs. So I think we can maybe move on to the next slide.
Yes, this would be good. I think this is a strong connection here to bringing in how Native-run organizations can create their own resources and ways that can overcome some of this that issue of institutional approachability and creating other resources that are more meaningful to audiences. And I'm glad to follow your lead on things you'd like to emphasize about this work.
Of course. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so And I agree with what you just said. So I think my work with NABs, I feel very lucky to sort of apply some of these same workflows and methods of my work on what we're calling the National Indian Boarding School Digital Archive, or NIBSDA for short. And this slide is just kind of an overview of the NAB's nonprofit mission statement. I won't read it off. You can read that off yourselves. But relating it to what we're talking about with Mashpee at a community tribal archive, same thing. We're trying to account for disparate collections that typically languish at repositories, and we want to do so that we can centralize them for a specific purpose, which kind of all ties into truth telling. Our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. So we're interested in truth telling. That's our primary motivator for the work at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. So this, of course, relates. I should probably pull back just a little bit and give you some context. So this kind of relates to the historical assimilative period between 1879 and the 1970s. The U.S. federal government removed thousands of American Indian and Alaskan Native children from their homes and also from their families, and placed them into assimilative boarding school institutions that were essentially meant to strip away their languages, identities, and their cultures. And they kind of did so in kind of a nefarious manner and very systematic sort of way. And my role here with NABs is to identify and account for wherever these records may exist. And I think our current findings on the question of where kind of puts the lion's share of records at federal, or relevant records at federal repositories. And I think that's just about 30% or something like that, and another 30% at church repositories, and about another 20% at historical societies, and the remainder at places like public libraries, museums, state repositories, even tribal archives have some material too that we're coming by. So again, my work, just kind of to extend further beyond that, is to ensure that our policies and workflows incorporate procedures and practices of community collaboration, data sovereignty strategies, and allowing for takedown, making sure that all those things are in place as we move forward with digitizing hundreds of thousands of boarding school records. And I think we clocked it in as almost 3.9 million catalog records, if we're kind of taking into account the number of schools, which was 367, and kind of average it out, give or take, knowing what we know about similar projects that are currently out there. It's about 3.9 million. And so that's kind of something that we're keeping in mind as we move forward and designing that platform, NIBSDA.
Yeah, let's start looking at these slides about that platform.
Yeah, go to that one real quick. So the forced removal of children, I think in kind of examining this history, I think we often come by documentation like this. It's a manual. So it's an Indian Babies Manual that kind of illustrates the level of hubris that assimilative institutions had on asserting their dominance over Indian children and their families to justify, taking their infants from their homes and from their families and from their cultures to produce something like this. It upsets me, and I think it should upset anybody. So we're kind of mindful of the fact that we want to make accessible material from a traumatic period, but we also have to sort of start to think about how do we make those materials accessible without further traumatizing. So these are all kinds of questions that we're trying to integrate into our process. So you can go to the next slide.
So this is the landing page for the NIBSTA archive itself.
Yeah, that's right. So still building it out, but you know, to illuminate those truths that I'm kind of referring to, NABS has been working on this major project in NIBSTA for about 3 years now. And so we're again attempting to digitize all boarding school relevant material and to populate them and to include them and feature them and make them accessible for future research use. And we're also wanting to aggregate data too, is kind of the other thing I mentioned, that there's other similar projects that have already been in existence for, I think it was 10 or 11 years. I think it was when the Dickinson project came out, helmed by Jim Gerenser over there. So we want to, you know, kind of treat it as a clearinghouse. And so we're working with these partners to, you know, establish a practical and agreeable workflow for doing so. And it's very tricky, but you know, I mentioned that it's going to be a powerful new resource with 3.9 million catalog records, which is crazy to sort of try to think about. But you know, it's being designed for this specific function of examining this very hazy period in history. And you can do you can do you can probably go to the different other slides. And you can do different data visualizations, you know, with mapping and mixing and matching cross sections of the data, you know. So we know that there's technologically speaking, we know that it's doable. We also want to do it right though. So the only way to do that is to involve communities as we move forward. So that's a record I like to bring up, because Audrey Baker, she was kind of considered a problem child and was disciplined, you know, and you see documentation evidence of that in her student case file. But you know, you also see instances of resistance too. She essentially, I think it's in the document description, but she lit the girls' dormitory on fire. So that's kind of an instance of resistance, and we're kind of wanting to make sure we highlight certain things like that. So we can go to the next page or slide.
And this is another visualization of how that particular file relates to other things. So I see like a chronological view and some other things going on here.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, we can do map visualizations.
And in terms of how's that process gone of sort of obtaining? I mean, I would imagine one step of this is identifying where there are records and then obtaining them, but also obtaining the data itself, the scans and so forth, but also the metadata. How have you found that process to work? I'm sorry if that's too broad of a question.
Yeah, that's very broad. When I hear that question, I hear cataloging best practices. You know, a lot of the time these cross sections or these bodies of records, they haven't been really touched, or they haven't really been described past you know, the folder level. So it's kind of nice to sort of begin from a point that hasn't really been or clearly articulated in a workflow sort of you know, sort of best practice guideline workflow is what I'm trying to say. We kind of take that and I should probably have included a digitization workflow to kind of make this point a little bit more clear. But part of the process is in getting tribal community feedback. And so once we you know, have a better understanding of what is included in a certain body of records, we kind of take that and get some guidance on what each community wants us to prioritize. We essentially want to digitize everything, but we can't do that, just in one sitting. So we want to prioritize certain things as we move forward. And so that's kind of where I get the most reward out of this work, is working with community, because there's also instances where we're kind of cultivating a community of practice with community. We're kind of normalizing archival practices, we're kind of normalizing record keeping, we're kind of normalizing interpretation sort of methods and that sort of stuff. So and each community is different, so we're kind of seeing different things take place. That, like I said, is really rewarding. So we're trying to do something here, something worthy of our spiritual exhaustion and mental and intellectual capacities. This is a collective effort too, because we're a coalition, of course. So we as people who regard truth and justice as paramount, we're wanting other people to sort of come in and work with us. So if any of your viewers right now are interested in becoming members, there's always opportunities to sort of lend the assist.
On this theme of truth telling, there's some other images here that you, in terms of that, what you're talking about, of there maybe these things were cataloged, but the sort of relevant details to be brought out to really do that truth telling work hadn't been brought out or present in existing cataloging or interpretation. There were some documents here you wanted to highlight that speak to this.
Yeah, I really want to kind of change gears and talk about research, and kind of, research isn't just research for research's sake. That's kind of one of my one of the epigraphs, or whatever you want to call it, for this section of the discussion. So again, research isn't just research for research's sake. It's a window into subject matter that has profoundly impacted the lives of people. And so, my work happens to focus on the lives of Indigenous people. So knowing that this is the case, there's kind of a proper way to engage in real time as we're doing the work and exhausting ourselves. There's a proper way to do that, and that's kind of the basis for any set of protocols. And in my training, it's the protocols for Native American archival material. So I'm starting to see more historians and journalists and archaeologists and academics, and librarians and archivists, all historic or modern. They're all kind of more or less guilty of pitfalls of seeking and searching for research, because it's essentially a trend. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Is the other thing, though. But what's important to know is that historically, we can sort of point to certain instances where that maybe hasn't been done from the best intentions, or maybe it's been done with sort of neutral intentions that have a neutral outcome. And I'm kind of thinking of salvage anthropology, and sort of how that the legacy of that push to document Indian people is kind of perceived now. So let's see, Carl Moore.
Well, in some of these documentations, you see what that kind of extractive quality that you identify in salvage anthropology and a lot of later research, and some of these documents that you bringing forward in the NIBSTA archive and others show how that extraction was occurring also in the boarding schools themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and based on what I'm starting to see, Indian boarding schools, we're kind of quarrying centers. We kind of think of the analogy of mining. It was kind of a center for extracting information, and so my parallel I'm trying to make with salvage anthropology is that early ethnographers, they were called ethnographers at the time, early anthropologists went in the community and tried to. Some were commissioned to do nationwide reporting, like Frank Speck, who's famous over there at the APS. We still look to those reports as pieces of information, and they're useful and that sort of thing, and communities take to them. But on the other hand, there was also other anthropologists and other sort of practitioners and professionals who were going into these schools, these boarding schools, and essentially exploiting and taking advantage of the students there. So you see this document here. Carl Moore is the supervisor of Indian education, and we're starting to see more correspondence just like this, where it's a day school principal. There was circulars that were sent out to satellite day schools, and this is essentially referring to a bound report of student artwork that Carl Moore had requested each principal at these day schools solicit from the students. And so he's kind of doing this work of, we can go to the next slide. He's kind of doing this work of, capturing native iconography, native imagery, getting basketry designs, and kind of repackaging them. And I don't know for what purposes, but he was the Indian Commissioner of Indian Education. So maybe there's an instance where he's trying to create curriculum, and so that's to benefit himself, and that's to benefit the agenda of the institution too. So there's this instance of a tragic irony where that I think some of the other slides illustrate very well is that on one hand, yep, there we go. On one hand, these institutions were suppressing the transmission or even the cultivation or retelling of indigenous knowledge and sort of pedagogies. And on the other hand, they were kind of mining and treating these children as a quarry to be taken advantage of. So this is another piece of documentation that one of our staffers shared with me. It's Montana native plants used by Blackfeet Indians collected by children of Blackfeet boarding school. And so that's the range botanist, V.A. Murphy, who, if you look at that booklet, there's pictures of each sort of plant variety, and there's kind of notations on ceremonial use and that sort of stuff. So that's all highly extractive, and there's all kinds of obvious indicators that this was pretty common at schools historically.
So one aspect I know that we want to that you've kind of gestured towards already, and I think it's part of what I wanted to highlight here in these slides too, is also in this active redescription the importance of not re-traumatizing people, of giving context, but also giving people warning and that kind of contextualization. Could you say a little bit more about your thoughts on ways to approach that appropriately?
Well, does the APS have a content warning? I'm just kind of curious.
We don't have a standard one, but there's kind of customized ones that we create for particular things, such as letters or content that gets into if I can think of examples of correspondence that describe grave robbing and things of that we want to make sure people are aware that that's what it is before they just dive into that. or things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fine.
It's not like a standalone one like some of these are, but they're more customized. But there is a more those needs may vary depending on the type of material. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things about centering Native voice, specifically around community, is that I'm starting to see more and more of these types of content warnings, and these are actually just screen grabs of journalist articles, so they're not necessarily archival. They weren't found on an archival, catalogs and that sort of thing. But I am starting to see more content warnings in archives catalogs. I think the better one that I've seen is part of NARA's website. There's other ones. I think maybe Princeton has one. I think Tufts University has one. But the point I'd like to make is that kind of taking it back to opportunists. Doesn't matter which profession. There are opportunists who kind of superficially approach things. On the other hand, there are professionals who try to do things in the correct manner. So, for instance, journalists need to follow up with continued care. I think one of the things about our society today is that we're prone to immediate gratification, and then the trends in the news kind of dictate how we operate as people. One moment we care about this, and the next moment we care about something else. I kind of read somewhere that we check our phones every 12 minutes, so we kind of have this sort of rapid shift in attention. Just kind of take that and imagine how much progress and work could be done in the public if we were to kind of tune into a consistent method of doing things, a consistent method of having our media cycles be determined. And I know that that's kind of living in an ideal society, but I think you kind of catch my meaning. Now, with regards to archivists, kind of bringing it back to archivists, I think it's easy to want to move forward and eagerly without centering tribal nations. If we're kind of talking about digitization projects and things like that, and it's difficult, so you have to continue to do this difficult work at times and do your due diligence. And I think it'll pay off when we kind of get around to having a sort of community conversations about how to bolster information, because as you're aware of, a lot of the time the catalog record legacy information is just inaccurate, and so there's an opportunity there. So there's this sort of holistic curation feedback that can be produced if archivists are doing that. And so for archaeologists, it's probably a good idea to center Native archaeologists and things like GPR or ground penetration radar. It wasn't long ago that archaeologists vehemently opposed NAGPRA, and some still do. Some still say weird things like I don't believe in reburying bones or whatever. And so there's this, you kind of need to cultivate reverence for the dead and really check yourself by this, by not having this sort of this me mentality that is kind of set in this guise of pursuing the scientific endeavor. So there's an ethic of empathy that I think absolutely needs to be exercised. And again, this isn't just research for research sake. It's a window into a traumatic issue that kind of needs to be thought of very carefully and deliberately. So again, content warnings in journalistic articles is just kind of an instance of treading lightly.
Mm-hmm. So we have, we're getting leave a few minutes for questions, but let's talk just quickly about there's some of the things you've mentioned, such as this providing correct context that's community informed, community directed, and controlled, is one of the elements of the protocols for Native American archival materials that was written about 15 years ago exactly, and only recently endorsed by Society of American Archivists. And one of the things that it didn't envision at the time that's changed over the years is this renaissance, as you've called it, of the development of archival repositories and other centers in tribal nations. With maybe a couple minutes, like what thoughts would you like to share on sort of that, where that response to the protocols and kind of where we are now and looking forward?
What's the time look like?
Believe it or not, at 60, it's 24 after. So we technically have 6 minutes left in the program.
Oh, 6 minutes.
We can go a few minutes over for questions. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah, thanks for moving us along, Brian. Yeah, this is this slide here is ATOM's Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, locations of North American information institutions, essentially, so museums, cultural centers, and archives. I think one of the things I wanted to convey relevant to this renaissance that I'm kind of discussing in relation to data management and working with community, because that hasn't really been seen before. That's kind of something that I think we're all collectively interested in, and we've bought into the idea for the most part that there's a merit to doing that. There's practical reasons, and there's it's just a good reason. It's just the right thing to do. So I think this was, so there's a statistic that ATOM had produced with one of its reports. I forget which one, but this was back in 2007. It was there's over 100 confirmed tribal archival institutions in the U.S. And so that I'm sure that number has increased because discussions like this are becoming more and more normalized, and so implementation of things like the protocols kind of spur and propel the necessity of tribal information institutions. So it's kind of a good time to really take stock of the direction that we're all headed in, and to kind of reflect, because it wasn't like this 15 years ago or whatever you say it was. I think it was 2005 or something that the PNAM was introduced. But the protocols, I checked out the Society of American Archivists oral history project interviews that SAA had conducted with SAA leadership. I checked that out a few months back. It's actually very illuminating if you ever had a chance to look at it. And I kind of became fixated on this 2010 interview with a former SAA leader. I won't out this person, but he was a president at one point in time, and it's very interesting insight and sort of the ideations of a former SAA leader. And his commentary kind of revolves around, minimizing the first archivist circle. The first archivist circle is the authors of the protocols for Native American archival material. So minimizing the first archivist circles, convening and designing and creating this document, as well as kind of proclaiming the tenets of the document as esoteric intangibles, I think is how we put it. So I think even though this type of rhetoric is and these kinds of attitudes are expected, it's still a reminder of how far not only SAA but just the profession has come to sort of including and integrating community-based considerations. And I think a lot of the very practical applications and learning opportunities that have been manifest since then are a testament to the viability of the protocols. So, you know, it's kind of taught us that, but people who are inspired by it, you know, they've kind of taught us that repatriation is an extension of deaccessioning. Nothing scary about that. They've also sort of taught us that having viable cultural sensitivity measures is merely an extension of existing restriction practices. Again, there's nothing scary about that, you know. Furthermore, you know, enculturating the records is merely an extension of good cataloging practices, and you know, to extend that further outward, sharing collections is a means to a viable collection development strategy. So early on, you know, there's a few people that I can think of that I think applied the tenets of the protocols. There's First Archivist Circle, of course. There's David Lewis, who did the SWARP project, kind of influenced my work with reclamation work. Kim Kristen, of course, of you know, Mukutu, and you know, ushering in to the use of TK labels and that sort of thing. Jennifer O'Neill, who really carried the fire within SAA, you know, regarding education, engagement of the protocols, and even ATOLM itself. I think, hopefully I'm getting this right, but I think ATOLM was partially, if not exclusively, created due to the livid response by Native professionals who were kind of profoundly disappointed in SAA's original positioning to the protocols. And of course, APS. Hey, APS. I think you guys particularly took what was being communicated in the protocols and sort of needing to adopt them and to, you know, adapt them into your institutional context. So, you know, there's a lot to be said about where we're at now. So there's a lot of great work being done to date, but I see a lot of changes also occurring in these trends. And I just want to probably make another point about, and I think we'll have to do another time check, but another trend I see occurring is this need for advisory boards. They're being developed by non-tribal institutions or organizations trying to make an effort to operationalize, you know, the way they're receptive to the needs of community. And so, you know, these boards consist of BIPOC folks and other marginalized communities. And so the tragedy of that, though, is that one, the bulk of the bulk of this work sort of falls on the shoulders of those communities, and two, you know, those institutions have not yet sort of realized the merit in adjusting their budgets to include those advisory boards in a more meaningful sort of capacity, in a capacity to make decisions, in a capacity to maintain consistency. And three, I think the last thing is those institutions have not really realized, you know, the merit in adjusting their budgets to, again, to hire somebody to do that work, you know. So
I think these are great points to wrap up, or just put a pause on a lot of further thoughts that I'm sure we could talk about for quite a bit longer. We are past the hour mark, and we've had a good conversation. We have a lot of great questions, but probably just a chance to get to one. We will share the questions too, in case it's possible to give feedback subsequently on some of the questions that have come in. But one that I really wanted to draw is just getting back towards community control and power. And one question that someone had is just like, as you're developing this NBSTA resource, are community comments or stories going to be available to add into those records? Is that an aspect that is being thought about how to draw that in and sort of to create new commentary and direct comments and new information and resources, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I mean, we're very mindful of the fact that these are colonial records that are have been created and have been maintained for a very specific operational reason, which was to assimilate kids. And so that's written from that viewpoint. The historic record is written from that viewpoint. So we want to subsequently not just digitize. We want to subsequently add enculturation treatments to the interpretation of those records too. So that's kind of the flip side of that coin. We want to make sure that there's almost like a response period to publishing these records as well, because one of the things we are trying to do as an organization is to empower community, but also uplift voice of those communities. And so one of the things I think I wanted to also say too before we wrap up as well is that I think in working with community, I think we're also reminded of the fact that there's suffering in the world. COVID was sort of a stark reminder of this, and there's definitely social, racial, and economic disparities that sort of factored early on into who received care and treatment and that sort of thing. So this also should be a reminder to researchers generally that research is not merely research. There is or there should be kind of as a normative statement, humanity attached to that research and embed into that process, into those methodologies.
I think that's a really key point to end on, and I think it gives important thing for all of us, especially outside researchers, outside institutions, to take with us and in all of the work that we do, and to recognize that it is the backbone of the work that organizations like NABS are doing. I would encourage the audience to look at the NABS site, including information on how to become a member and what that means, because this is an important organization to support and follow. Because there will be greater building of these resources, and to spread the word about the NABS work, and I'm sure to be in touch. Stephen, welcome people being in touch about thoughts or feedback they have. And with that, unfortunately, time being time, we will have to stop at that point. But Stephen, I want to thank you very much for making yourself available and sharing your thoughts. As in all sense, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of just gesturing to a lot of big areas that could themselves warrant full conversations. So thank you again for your time. If you want to say any parting words, I'll give the floor to you.
No, I think I wish we had more time, and I'm very curious about some of these questions, so maybe there's an opportunity for me to respond. But thank you all for being in attendance, and thank you, Brian, for inviting me here.
We'll be sure to pass the questions along so you can give feedback and also be in touch with folks for whom that'd be of interest. And we'd like to thank all of you and our audience for being with us today. This will be posted online soon too on the APS website and YouTube channel for people to view if you know people who had to miss it. And we hope that you are all well, and you and your friends and family are well. And we'll see you again next time. Take care.